The highway was empty and dark, like a moonless night over the desert. The headlights of his Audi RS6 picked out the gloom only from the serpentine road and the side of the road where movement suddenly flashed. Jason reacted instantly. The girl's figure, illuminated by the flashing flashlight of her phone, stood beside the car with a flat tire. Alone, in the middle of the night, on an empty highway he could have just driven by. Fatigue from the shoot pressed on her eyelids, wanting only to go home, but something inside wouldn't let him. Statham slowed down. The door opened, and the cold night air hit his face. "Is there a problem?" His voice sounded flat, but inside he already felt that this meeting would change everything. Before we get back to that, I'd love to know where you're watching this video from today, and if you like these stories, make sure you subscribe because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The highway stretched into the darkness, empty and silent except for the occasional headlights of distant trucks. The soft hum of the Audi RS6's engine was the only company Jason Statham had as he drove through the night, his body heavy with exhaustion after a long day on set. His mind was already drifting toward the comfort of his bed when a flicker of movement on the roadside. His sharp eyes caught a figure illuminated by the faint glow of a phone's flashlight. A woman. Alone. Next to a car with a flat tire. He could have kept driving. It wasn't his problem. But something, some instinct, made him slow down. The car rolled to a stop, and as he stepped out, the cold night air hit him. Jason took a closer look at the stranded woman. Blonde, elegant even in distress, but there was something in her eyes, calm, yet determined. Trouble? His voice was steady, but deep down, he already had a feeling this night was about to change everything. The woman turned toward him, lowering her phone. The dim light revealed delicate features, piercing blue eyes, and an air of quiet confidence despite the situation. "Yeah," she sighed, brushing a strand of golden hair from her face. "Flat tire. And my jack is useless." Jason glanced at the deflated rubber. Not the worst breakdown, but stranded on a deserted highway in the middle of the night? Not ideal. "You're lucky I came by," he said, kneeling beside the car. "Or were you hoping some lunatic would stop instead?" She smirked. "Guess I like to live dangerously." Jason let out a short chuckle as he reached into his trunk, pulling out his own jack. He worked swiftly, years of action films and stunt training making the task effortless. The woman, however, didn't just stand back and watch. "So, are you always a roadside hero, or am I just special?" she asked, crossing her arms. Jason tightened the lug nuts and wiped his hands on his jeans before looking up at her. "Maybe a little bit of both," he replied. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that, for a brief second, made him forget the fatigue pressing down on him. "I'm Rosie," she finally introduced herself. "Rosie Huntington-Whiteley." Jason paused, recognizing the name. He wasn't one to follow fashion, but even he had heard of her. British, like him. Stunning, clearly. "Jason," he said, standing up. "Jason Statham." Her smile widened. "Oh, I know." Something shifted between them in that moment. A spark. "Since you saved my life tonight," Rosie said playfully, "how about I buy you a drink?" Jason hesitated. He was dead tired. But there was something about her, something he wasn't ready to walk away from just yet. "All right," he said, flashing a smirk. "But only if I pick the place." Rosie raised an eyebrow. "Deal." And just like that, a simple roadside breakdown turned into something far more interesting. The night air was crisp as Jason and Rosie pulled into a quiet roadside diner. Neon lights flickered above the entrance, casting a faint red glow over the parking lot. Inside, the place was nearly empty, just a sleepy-looking cashier and an old trucker nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. Jason led the way to a booth, sliding in across from Rosie. The hum of an old jukebox filled the silence as she picked up the menu, scanning it with amusement. A roadside diner at midnight, she mused, raising an eyebrow. Classy choice. Jason smirked. "Trust me, the coffee here is legendary." Rosie chuckled, setting the menu down. "All right, then. Surprise me." Jason signaled the waitress and ordered 2 coffees, black, no sugar. As they waited, he leaned back, studying her. He had met plenty of beautiful women in his line of work, but there was something different about Rosie. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't intimidated either. She was just herself. "So, a Hollywood action star stops to rescue a stranded model in the middle of the night," she said, resting her chin on her hand. "Sounds like the beginning of a bad movie." Jason smirked. "Depends on the director." Their coffees arrived, steaming and strong. Rosie took a sip, nodding approvingly. "Not bad. Maybe you do have good taste." Jason chuckled, taking a sip himself. "So, what's your story? How does someone like you end up stuck on the side of the road alone?" Rosie sighed, swirling her spoon in the cup. "Long story short? I was coming back from a shoot. Took a wrong turn, and then, bam, flat tire. Lucky me." Jason nodded. "Guess luck brought us both here." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. A moment of silence, comfortable yet charged with an undercurrent of something more. Rosie broke it first. "And you? What's the real Jason Statham like when he's not punching bad guys on screen?" Jason exhaled, shaking his head with a smirk. "Less explosions. Fewer car chases. Just a guy who likes quiet nights, good coffee, and fixing tires for strangers, apparently." Rosie laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Well, I have to say, I'm glad you did." Jason watched her, the exhaustion of the days slowly fading. This wasn't just another Hollywood encounter. It was something real. And for the first time in a long time, he was curious to see where it would lead. The neon glow of the diner flickered above them as Jason walked Rosie to her car. The air had turned cooler, carrying the distant hum of the highway. A part of him expected this moment to feel like the natural end of the night, fix a tire, have a coffee, say goodbye. But something about it didn't sit right. It felt unfinished. Rosie slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, smooth as ever. "All right," she said with a small smile, gripping the wheel. "Guess this is where I say thanks and drive off into the night?" Jason smirked, leaning against the car door. "That's one option." She raised an eyebrow. "And the other?" He hesitated for just a second before replying, "You stick around for one more cup of coffee." She let out a soft chuckle. "Tempting, but I don't want to overstay my welcome in your favorite 5-star establishment." Jason glanced back at the diner, shaking his head with a smirk. "Yeah, you're right. Place gets pretty exclusive past midnight." Rosie bit her lip, hesitating for the first time. She looked like she wanted to say something, but instead, she just exhaled and rested her hands on the wheel. "Well, maybe our paths will cross again." Jason held her gaze. "Maybe they will." Neither of them moved. It was that strange kind of goodbye, the kind where both people know it shouldn't really be a goodbye at all. Finally, Rosie put the car into drive and rolled down the window. "Try not to save too many damsels in distress while I'm gone, all right?" Jason smirked. "Only if you promise not to get any more flat tires." She laughed softly, and with one last glance, she pulled onto the road, disappearing into the night. Jason stood there for a few moments, hands in his pockets, watching the taillights fade. Then, with a quiet sigh, he got into his own car and started the engine. As he drove off into the night, one thought lingered in his mind: this didn't feel like the end. Not even close. Days passed, but Jason couldn't shake the memory of that night. He had met countless people in his career, actors, directors, celebrities, but something about Rosie stuck with him. The way she carried herself, her quick wit, that spark in her eyes. He had half a mind to track her down, but he knew how Hollywood worked. People met, had fleeting moments, and moved on. That was the industry. That was life. But fate had other plans. It was late afternoon when his phone buzzed. Jason was in his home gym, wrapping up a workout, sweat dripping down his back. He grabbed a towel and checked the screen. Unknown number. He frowned but answered anyway. Statham. A familiar voice came through the line, light and teasing. So, do you always fix flat tires for strangers, or was that just my lucky night? Jason blinked, a slow smirk forming. Rosie? The one and only. He leaned against the wall, gripping the towel. Didn't think I'd hear from you again. Yeah, well, I figured I owed you at least one proper thank you. That, and I was wondering if you actually know a decent place for dinner, or if gas station diners are really your thing. Jason chuckled. You doubting my taste? Rosie laughed softly. Just testing it. Jason didn't hesitate. All right then. How about tonight? There was a pause, then a playful, I suppose I can make time. He smirked. I'll pick you up at 8. Looking forward to it, Statham. The line went dead, but Jason stood there for a moment, his smirk widening. Yeah. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. The city lights shimmered as Jason pulled up outside Rosie's apartment in his sleek black Aston Martin Vantage. He rarely felt nervous, but tonight was different. It wasn't just another dinner. It was her. And something about her made this feel like more than just a casual night out. Before he could overthink it, the door opened, and Rosie stepped out. She was stunning. Dressed in an effortlessly elegant black dress, her blonde waves cascading over her shoulders, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made Jason's usual cool demeanor flicker for a second. He got out and walked around to open the passenger door. Not bad, he said, giving her an approving nod. Rosie smirked. Coming from you, I'll take that as a major compliment. Jason chuckled and gestured to the car. Shall we? The restaurant he chose was discreet, the kind of place where people went to enjoy a meal without cameras flashing in their faces. A cozy corner table, dim lighting, and a wine list that even the best sommeliers would admire. All right, I'll admit, Rosie said as they settled in. This is much better than a roadside diner. Jason smirked. Told you I had taste. The conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about their work, their lives outside of the spotlight, and the unexpected ways their paths had led them here. Rosie shared stories of growing up in the English countryside, her journey into modeling, and the challenges of balancing fame with a normal life. Jason, in turn, spoke about his early days as a competitive diver, his transition into acting, and the thrill of doing his own stunts. Rosie leaned in, intrigued. So, no fear? No hesitation when you jump off buildings or hang off helicopters? Jason took a sip of his drink and smirked. Fear's always there. The trick is to make it work for you. Rosie watched him for a moment, then nodded. I like that. By the time dinner was over, neither of them wanted the night to end. As Jason drove her home, the city lights casting fleeting glows over their faces, Rosie glanced at him. I had a good time tonight. Jason glanced back, a rare softness in his gaze. Yeah. Me too. As he pulled up in front of her place, he walked her to the door. There was a quiet moment, a pause heavy with the kind of tension that could only lead to one thing. Rosie looked up at him, a playful glint in her eyes. So, is this where you say goodnight like a gentleman? Jason smirked. That depends. Do I get a second date? She pretended to think for a second, then smiled. I suppose I can make time. Jason let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You're trouble, you know that? Rosie grinned. You have no idea. And with that, she leaned in and kissed him, just a brief, teasing brush of lips before stepping back with a knowing smile. Jason watched her disappear into her building, his smirk lingering as he got into his car. Yeah. He was in trouble. The best kind. The second date happened just days after the first. Then a third. Then a fourth. What started as a chance roadside meeting turned into late-night conversations, spontaneous weekend getaways, and a connection that neither of them had expected. Jason wasn't the kind of man to fall easily. He had built a life around control, both on screen and off. But with Rosie, things were different. She challenged him, teased him, and made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, at ease. One evening, they found themselves on the rooftop of Jason's Los Angeles home. The city stretched out below them, lights twinkling like stars. Rosie sat curled up on the lounge chair, a glass of wine in hand, while Jason leaned against the railing, sipping his whiskey. "You know," Rosie mused, staring out at the skyline, "I never thought I'd end up dating an action star." Jason smirked. "That's so?" She nodded, turning to him. "I always thought those Hollywood tough guys were just for the cameras. But you," she paused, studying him. "You're different." Jason met her gaze. "Yeah? How so?" Rosie took a sip of her wine, considering her words. "You don't try to impress. You just are." Jason let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "That's because I don't need to impress you." Rosie raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Confident, aren't you?" He leaned in slightly, his voice lower. "You like that, don't you?" She rolled her eyes playfully, but the way her lips curled into a smile told him everything he needed to know. The night stretched on, and as the conversation deepened, Rosie suddenly grew quiet. She set her glass down and looked at Jason with an expression he hadn't seen before, serious, vulnerable. "Do you ever wonder where this is going?" she asked softly. Jason studied her for a long moment. He wasn't a man of big speeches. He didn't do grand, romantic declarations. But he wasn't the type to avoid the truth either. So he gave it to her straight. "I know one thing," he said, his voice steady. "I don't want this to stop." Rosie exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Me neither." Jason reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a promise. This wasn't just some Hollywood fling. It was real. And Jason Statham didn't back down from anything real. Months passed, and what had started as an unexpected roadside encounter had become something deeper. Something real. Jason and Rosie weren't just dating, they were partners. Their lives were chaotic, filled with travel, film sets, and red carpets. But somehow, in the madness of it all, they had carved out something steady. Something unshakable. One evening, after returning from a shoot, Jason stepped into their London home, exhausted but content. The scent of fresh candles filled the air, and soft jazz played from the speakers. Rosie was in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing one of his shirts, stirring a pot of something that smelled amazing. Jason leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment. "You know, I could get used to this." Rosie turned, smirking. "The food or the view?" Jason walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Both." She laughed, resting her head against his chest. "You're getting soft, Statham." Jason smirked. Not a chance. The truth was, he had never been softer in his life. And for the first time, he was okay with that. Later that night, as they sat on the couch, wine glasses in hand, Rosie glanced at him with a different kind of smile. "What?" Jason asked, raising an eyebrow. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I was just thinking. It's funny how life works. If I hadn't gotten that flat tire that night, we might have never met." Jason chuckled, setting his glass down. "Oh, we would have met." Rosie tilted her head. "Oh, really?" Jason nodded, a confident smirk playing on his lips. "Yeah. You were meant to be mine, one way or another." Rosie's eyes softened, and for a moment, the teasing stopped. She reached out, taking his hand. "I already am," she whispered. Jason tightened his grip around her fingers, pulling her close. He wasn't a man of grand romantic gestures. He didn't need to be. Because at the end of the day, words didn't matter. She was here. And this? This was just the beginning.